Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Buddhist Studies podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Kate Hartman, Assistant Professor of Buddhist Studies at the University of Wyoming and Director of Buddhist Studies Online. I'm here today talking with Dr. Karin Meyers, who is Academic Director at the Mangalam Research Center in Berkeley, California. She received her PhD with distinction from the University of Chicago Divinity School in 2010, focusing on Buddhist philosophy. She's taught Buddhist studies at a variety of colleges and universities, including at Rangjung Yeshe Institute's Center for Buddhist Studies in Nepal. So welcome, Karin. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, Kate.
So I'll start with kind of standard question, let people get to know you a little bit. How did you get started in Buddhist studies?
Well, I was interested, I think, even before I got to college. I was always a little bit curious about it's kind of natural born philosopher, maybe curious about what is this thing called life and what is this, different kind of states of consciousness were fascinating to me, even as a kid. And I couldn't understand why other people weren't as interested as me. And so when I got to college, I was introduced to Buddhist philosophy with a course from Jay Garfield. I went to Hampshire College and he was there at the time, and he taught this course, Skepticism and Idealism, East and West. And part of it is definitely having a great teacher who's clearly excited about the topic, was very inspiring, but also I fell in love with philosophy in general and Buddhist philosophy in particular.
That's so great. Yes. And as someone who's had Jay Garfield as an instructor as well, it really does get you so excited to explore these things. And so you continued your studies after Hampshire by going to the University of Chicago, where I think you had graduated just before I had gotten there. So we didn't quite overlap, but you were sort of a legend in the Buddhist philosophy circle. So why don't you tell us about your experience at Chicago?
Yeah, and maybe I should just wind back a little bit because this will be relevant to people taking the course. But when I was at Hampshire, I went on the very first study abroad program to Sarnath, India, which is where the Buddha gave his first discourse. And we stayed, and this trip was all arranged by Jay Garfield, and I stayed at Tibetan University there. And then later we went up to Dharamsala. And so that too was really formative. And then the next year I went back for a full year of or almost 9 months of study. So that was very formative. Well, Jay just assumed I was going to go to grad school. I wasn't totally sure, but after a couple of years out of grad school, traveling and working, I got, I really missed the intellectual stimulation. And so I decided to go to the University of Chicago, in part because it wasn't just Buddhist studies. So it was at the time, maybe a little bit of an unusual, there were some excellent scholars there, including Matthew Kapstein, who became my advisor, but it was a little bit of an unusual choice for Buddhist studies at the time, as it was within a larger divinity school department. But it was great. I loved it.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And that's, something interesting that listeners might not expect is that there can sometimes be this institutional divide between Buddhist philosophy, which is sometimes, categorized under this heading of religion and maybe not really philosophy, from philosophy proper. And so, finding instructors like Jay Garfield who are engaged in this kind of cross-cultural inquiry that says that each of the parties involved here has so much to learn and gain from the other side, finding a place like that does really engage philosophy sort of all together is a valuable experience.
Yeah, I should have said that one of the the other reason I decided to go to the University of Chicago, despite the fact that there was also, theology and other religions being studied there, which I've been continually curious about, was the fact that it was one of the few places that you could go and, there was a philosophy of religions track, but you could do an Indian Buddhist philosophy version of that, a Tibetan Buddhist philosophy version of that.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas in philosophy departments, that was very challenging. You couldn't really do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I like to think that this is, changing now as, hopefully philosophy departments are recognizing the incredible insights that they can get from Buddhist philosophy and the fact that, addressing a lot of the same sort of fundamental human issues, but addressing them, from just enough of a different perspective to kind of shake things up a little bit. And so at your time at Chicago, you wrote a dissertation called Freedom and Self-Control, Free Will in South Asian Buddhism. And I loved your dissertation. I highly recommend it to anyone who's interested in that sort of thing, because these are questions that always arise when I'm teaching Buddhism. So maybe I can frame the question this way. What was the kind of problem or question that motivated you to start this study? Right? Free will is something we hear a lot about, but, what interested you in this topic?
Yeah, honestly, it was because I was doing a lot of adjunct teaching. We weren't that well funded at that time. That changed. But so anyways, I was doing lots of adjunct teaching and my students were asking it. And I was like, I don't know. And So I had to do some research. And as soon as I started doing the research, I'm like, people do not agree on this. And like some of the fundamental questions that come up in regard to free will, first of all, what is free will? How do we translate that? Does it translate that, does that translate into Buddhist terms? And another question is about determinism. So often free will is, you either think it's compatible or not compatible with determinism. And so is dependent origination, is it a theory of causation? Is it deterministic? And I found that scholars really disagreed on that as well. So then I just, inspired by my students, I went and investigated that, primarily looking at Abhidharma sources. And I can say maybe a little bit more about that later.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because that's, the question students have when you present them with this, theory of dependent origination, that everything arises in dependence on something else. You have this theory of karma that says that, present actions cause future consequences that are related to these present actions. And Buddhism also has this, idea of anatta or anatman, non-self, right? And to a lot of students, you present those three ideas together and they get this sense that this is a deterministic system in which there is no sense of personal control, freedom, autonomy. And, it generates this question of like, well, what power do I, if there is such a thing, have to change my future, to get better or to get worse? And so what did your sort of research on this question, what are some of the answers that you give when people ask you questions like that?
I always struggle with it because it took me, 250 pages to answer the question. So much depends on definition of terms. Is there a term equivalent to free will? As I mentioned before, another question is, what is this theory of karma and causation? Does it mean that there's only one possible future? My argument is no. And so I don't really think it's an issue of determinism versus indeterminism. Indeterminism poses different problems for free will. It's more of a question of, well, who is, if there is something like free will. And so that's kind of how I describe something like free will. So in Buddhism, we have intention, and we have intention that is more or less free in terms of determined by afflictive habits, or by wholesome qualities. That's more of a concern to Buddhists, that what kind of mental states are governing our intentions. That's more important than the question of, there's no uncaused, as you mentioned, there's nothing that's uncaused. There couldn't be freedom in that way.
Yeah, one of the ways that I sort of think about this with students sometimes is, think back to the last time you were really angry. What did you do? And now looking back, now that you're not so angry, do you endorse the actions that you took then? Was that a time that you felt free? And oftentimes they'll say, no, I didn't mean to snap at my mom on the phone. I didn't mean to say that rude thing to my roommate, but I was so controlled by my anger in that moment. It just happened and now I regret it. And so you sort of explore that, like, well, what are the situations in which you do feel free? That when you do actions later, you say, yeah, that was what I wanted to do. That was the right thing to do in that situation.
Yeah. And in both those questions, who is doing it? So that becomes more of the problem, I think, for Buddhists to solve is who is doing that, which will be a topic we'll talk about in the course.
Yes. And I'm sure, one could have a 12-week course entirely on that and barely scratch the surface. And so following, completing this dissertation, you taught at various places, including most notably Rangjung Yeshe. And this actually touches on what you were saying earlier about your experiences studying abroad, spending time in Asia, as being really transformative for you. So maybe this is a two-part question of, what do these experiences abroad generally, how do they shape your experience and understanding of Buddhism, of Buddhist philosophy? And two, was there anything at your time at Rangjung Yeshe that, sort of shaped your journey?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think maybe my first time in India, it was my first time. I guess I'd been abroad, maybe to Europe and Canada before, but it was my first time in a place that was really different. And so that was just, and my first time being immersed, staying at this Tibetan school, especially when I stayed for a year and then going to Dharamsala, just being immersed in that culture for a long time really just made me curious about the different ways that different traditions understand the world, just whole different systems of knowledge and values and orientations. And I think when I was at Rangjung Yeshe, so I was there for 7 years, so I was there for quite a while.
And maybe we could explain what Rangjung Yeshe is to audience members.
Yes.
Because I also spent some time at Rangjung Yeshe myself, so...
Oh, I didn't know that. Oh, well, I'll talk about that sometime.
Mm-hmm.
Rangjung Yeshe Institute started from Choki Nyima Rinpoche, who's the abbot of a monastery there, Kaning Shedribling Monastery. It started as a program for his students that wanted to study Buddhist philosophy more, over a longer period of time, more in depth. And then over time, before I got there, it had evolved into the Center for Buddhist Studies, which had both a bachelor's and a master's program accredited through Kathmandu University, but run out of the monastery there. So it was an interesting environment to teach, because I and a couple other colleagues were teaching, kind of bringing modern Western academic approach to Buddhist studies and Buddhist philosophy, while my monastic colleagues in Tibetan tradition were teaching primarily in a traditional monastic mode, adapted a little bit for Western students, but primarily very traditional way of teaching. And then there was a huge language component to the program there. So it was really a very different context than teaching in the West, which in the US, which I'd done quite a bit at that point. And one of the things that was so wonderful about it is that the students were, it was an international program, right? So we had students from Nepal and India and Himalayas. We also had them from Europe and South America and the US, and they had all, and East Asia as well. And they'd all come there, made even local students, it's quite a big thing to tell your parents, no, I'm not going to be a doctor. I'm going to study Buddhist philosophy. So everyone there, all the students were, genuinely curious. Not everyone was Buddhist, but they were, they had made the effort to come to Nepal to study. So they were genuinely curious about the topic. So it was really, as you may know, that's, totally spoils you as a teacher.
Mm-hmm.
To have students that are like excited about the subject.
Oh my goodness, it's such a joy to teach students who are there because they are just inherently fascinated with the subject. It's one of the things I like most about Buddhist Studies Online, and so because yes, that is sort of a difference between the University of Chicago and Rangjung Yeshe, where Chicago is great in that it was blending sort of Buddhist philosophy and sort of more traditional philosophy as it is conceived in the American university, but it's also not a place where practice necessarily is thought of as part of your education, whereas at Rangjung Yeshe, you have more of a presence of practitioners. You're getting instructed by monastic trained, traditionally qualified Buddhist philosophers. So what's that environment like, and what do you think marks the study of Buddhist philosophy in that mode as sort of special or unique or remarkable?
Yeah, so I too, was attracted to this. I had a kind of funny reasoning for going to grad school. I thought it would support my Buddhist practice, although I have to say,
opposite sometimes.
It made that a little challenging. However, I think that's different at Rangjung Yeshe Institute, and like I said, not every student was a practicing Buddhist, but all were curious, and many were. Many were committed Tibetan Buddhists, some were from other traditions. And it opened up a realm of inquiry, which we find in traditional Buddhist philosophy. And so in Indian Buddhist philosophy and Tibetan, East Asian Buddhist philosophy, there is an acknowledgement and inquiry into, what is the nature of reality when viewed with a consciousness which is different from our ordinary consciousness, which Buddhists would call delusion. And so to be able to entertain these perspectives informed by contemplative tradition, also informed by traditional Buddhist cosmology and ethics. And so the study of philosophy is fundamentally, we don't think of it this way, I don't think too much in the West, but the study of philosophy is a fundamentally ethical endeavor in Buddhism. So yeah, it provided Rangjung Yeshe Institute and other places where you're studying Buddhism. So also where I am now at Mangalam Research Center is that you're able to have conversations with other practitioners or people who are curious and open about what is it like for Buddhists to have conversations about kind of the larger context in which philosophy takes place. So philosophy isn't just reasoning and observation of the natural world. There's always a tradition and culture and larger human context in terms of different dimensions of being human, in terms of like I said, like different kinds of states of consciousness. For for Buddhists over time, right? We exist in over many lifetimes, according to Buddhist thought. So to be able to bring all of that context and questions about that into the study of Buddhist philosophy is just more richer and fascinating for me.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's certainly something that I talk about with students a lot, is that, the Buddha was not interested in philosophical questions, and most later Buddhists weren't interested in philosophical questions just for the sort of intellectual fun of it. Although I think we would agree to say that it is fun and it is a joy to study these things. But it was all sort of oriented towards this goal of eliminating suffering, right? And so, it's interesting sometimes when teaching Buddhist philosophy, you'll get people who say, well, just, shut up and meditate. You don't need to think about any of this stuff. And, if that works for people, more power to them. But, it's an interesting feature of the Buddhist tradition is that people wrote a lot about philosophy because they cared about getting this account right. So why do you think Buddhists spent so much time debating these philosophical ideas or critiquing each other, sometimes not so gently, because they really cared about getting this account of reality right? Mm-hmm. How did that function in this broader context of trying to eliminate suffering?
Yeah. Well, one thing is just, how do we meditate correctly? As you know, some of the earliest Buddhist discourses are about how other traditions have messed up the meditation and they've gotten confused about, what different meditative states mean. And so how to meditate correctly to bring an end to suffering is part of the motivation. I would say too, that I think there is some element of enjoyment of reason, of reasoning, enjoyment of debate, wanting to, promote your school or your vision over others. We can't dismiss these kinds of socio-political, psychological reasons for engaging in Buddhist philosophy. But again, knowing, because the stakes are so high, and I should have mentioned this, I tend to get a little bit excited with the possibilities presented in Buddhist philosophy and the perspectives in the world. And sometimes I forget that point. Yes, the fundamental point is the alleviation of suffering. And so to properly diagnose what the problem is. This is the main thing that, different schools, they end up with slightly different diagnoses. This is the main problem. No, this is it. Mm-hmm. And because it's defined in this way, this is how we need to practice. And they'll have different answers about that. And sometimes they answer in ways that really accommodates other views, that this is, it depends on, your particular constitution, or there's sort of higher, and usually it's hierarchical, the ways that Buddhists sort through differences of opinion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that philosophy is not sort of outside of or extraneous to practice, but that it was thought of as necessary for sort of directing correct practice in a lot of ways. But your statement about getting really excited about particular outlooks and perspectives offered by Buddhist philosophy makes me want to follow up. What are some of these really exciting perspectives that you find energizing?
Well, I guess one sort of topic of mine, which I've not really written much about, but it's something that I'm building towards. I'm giving a course in the fall at Mangalam Research Center on Buddhism and the imagination. I'm also hosting a National Endowment for the Humanities summer institute. Next, we had to cancel it a couple times postpone it a couple times because of COVID, but hopefully it'll happen next June on Buddhism and the imagination. It's called The Imagination and Imaginal Worlds in the Mirror of Buddhism. And one thing that I've been really interested in both in terms of my own experience, but also, especially as I look at comparative religions, is the ways in which our imagination, and this is not individual imagination, this is collective, cultural, often, we could say intersubjective imagination, the way it shapes our experience. And so this can be experience in our ordinary sensory world, and then throughout Buddhist traditions, experience in these other realms. And so your own research touches a lot on this in terms of the use of imagination and visualization in pilgrimage practices. And we find this in Buddhist Pure Land traditions, even in Indian Buddhist philosophical tradition, Yogacara, which we'll look at in this course, really starts to theorize, well, how is it that we experience or how beings are able to experience a world together, even though so much is shaped by their individual karma. Mm-hmm. So that's one of the things that really, and then how it works across culturally. So in different religious traditions, you have totally different kinds of worlds. And I don't think it's not sufficient, in my view, to just dismiss these as, oh, well, that's just, they've made that up as part of their literary tradition. Literary tradition has a huge role, I think, in shaping these worlds. But to reduce it to that, I think, is a little bit, it's a little bit too reductive, as there is so much experience and wisdom that comes through commerce in these imaginal realms. Mm-hmm. And so that's one of the things that excites me, which isn't quite on, it is related to, you have to do a little bit of additional explanation, explain how that's related to the basic problem of suffering.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the ways that I, often conceptualize this is that Buddhism is all about this path, right, of diagnosing sort of like where you've come from, where it is that you're going, and then the path from, suffering to this, often imagined state, right? Because, Buddhist texts talk about nirvana, or they talk about pure lands, or they talk about, in my case, when I study pilgrimage traditions in Tibet, about the sort of wondrous world of the pilgrimage place, where all these divine sort of what we might call miracles are just evident all around. And those are things that are quite distant from our ordinary experience. We don't experience the world as in the ways nirvana is described, in the way the Pure Land is described, in the way sort of the wonders of pilgrimage are described. And yet it is so important for the path because it gives you a sense of destination, right? So you're oriented in terms of a kind of a time scale, right? Of this is where I'm coming from, this is where I'm going. And even if it's quite distant, one, it's motivating that you have a place to go. And two, it structures the path. If I want to get to this imagined place, this is how it's going to affect my practice now. Yeah.
Thank you for that. That's great. And also, imagining the places we don't want to go, right? Buddhists are really creative, very elaborate hell realms and animal realms, which I'm not sure really fair to call them. I'm not sure Buddhists are always as generous to the possibilities of the animal realm as we might be today.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I'm reminded of Buddhist Studies Online 102's instructor Danielle Stewart worked on early meditation texts that were really, really cosmological. And we're talking about the realms of rebirth, so the 6 major realms of rebirth that you can be reborn in, and spent a lot of time talking about, what it's like to be a preta, what it's like to be a hungry ghost, what it's like to be an animal, what it's like to be a hell being. And, certain in modern, especially like North American, Euro-American Buddhism, a lot of that cosmological stuff can drop out, right? Because people want something that can be, a bit more compatible with maybe their sort of modern naturalistic ways of looking at the world. And yet, in these early texts, we find a lot of ink is spilled on it, therefore it seems important to people to really think in these cosmological ways of what could happen if you behave in certain ways, or I like the way you phrase that, the places you want to go and imagining the places you don't want to go as well. And that actually maybe connects me to something you've been more involved in more recently, which is your activism around the climate crisis, which in some ways I do think is a failure of imagination on the part of folks who don't necessarily think that it is possible to address, or maybe don't want to think about the future that we are inadvertently creating. So maybe why don't you just tell us a little bit about why you feel so motivated to address these issues, and then maybe some of your activism around them.
Yeah, so when I started, just before I went to grad school, I worked at the Buddhist Peace Fellowship. And I think at that, it was pretty much a couple years after college. And I think at that point, I was really interested in what was happening in the world, and wanting to much more aware, I think, then of the ecological crisis, which I sort of put out of my mind for many years. And it became impossible to put out of my mind for the last several years. And although I call it activated, it took a while for me to become activated because I didn't know. I think like many of us, I think this must be a very broad thing. Maybe not everyone feels it, but many of us, I imagine, feel this. As I just felt kind of like, well, what can I possibly, the problem of the climate and ecological crisis is so large. And there's the scale of the forces against making the kinds of changes that we need to make to address it are so huge that I just felt sort of paralyzed. And I was working at the Insight Meditation Society for a year. I was kind of taking a year out of academia to work as retreat support there. I was taking care of yogis who were who had if they needed to go to the doctor, or if they needed somebody to talk to. And so I thought I'd be having this year of retreat and practice and just, be on semi-retreat all year. And of course, that's when I got activated to be very involved in the world rather than on retreat. And so I just started through, a number of coincidences as this thing happened. I ended up organizing Buddhist and affiliated meditators. We had a lot of Unitarians and other people with contemplative practice who joined us. But I just started organizing. I stopped worrying that I didn't know what to do and just started acting. And we did some meditation protests, and that's kind of where I got started. And then I'd kind of use my contacts, like you and other people at universities, to give talks on this topic in light of, I found some interesting there were a lot of Buddhists in Extinction Rebellion, and I was curious about that. And so I was trying to work out why that was, while also raising awareness people knew about the climate crisis, but sort of raising awareness that there's actions going on and you can join. Mm-hmm. So I started giving a number of talks on the topic and writing a little bit, not too much on it. And I'm continuing to explore some of that, and also continuing. Now I moved to Berkeley to be at Mangalam Research Center. So I'm sort of in between COVID and everything. I'm just kind of figuring out well, how does this look now? We have a little East Bay Eco-Sattva group, and we have a decolonizing reading group, and we have an eco-grief circle, and we do some actions, but it's not quite fully formed yet. So yeah, we'll see how that unfolds.
Yeah, and so one of the groups you mentioned is a group of eco-sattvas. Maybe could you tell us a little bit more about that term?
Yeah, maybe that's not totally crystal clear to everyone. So in Mahayana Buddhism, there is the Bodhisattva, beings who awaken for the sake of liberating all beings, or beings who are working for the liberation of all beings, another way to put that. And an eco-sattva is a being who's working for the benefit of the entire ecological system, you could say, including humans and the more than human world.
Yeah, and so, there's so many interesting questions raised by sort of this type of engagement, which is, of course, oriented towards the elimination of suffering. And right, the forms that suffering takes in the modern world are often different than what the Buddha could have imagined, right? Or perhaps he did, and just, we don't have any writings on that. But certainly in 5th century BC India, humans did not yet have the power to totally alter the climate that enables all of us to live. And yet now we find ourselves in this position of having to deal with these issues. And it raises all sorts of really interesting questions about, engaged Buddhism and how to balance these things. So maybe I'll go through some of these one by one. How do you balance this need for sort of activism and public awareness raising and doing actions and things like that with, sort of a need to stay grounded and maybe not get overly stressed out by the kind of state of crisis that we're in? You mentioned that part of when you got sort of activated was at a retreat center, and that you have lots of people with contemplative backgrounds involved. So how do you think about balancing these sort of aspects, or do you see them as complementary?
I see them as complementary. However, I feel like realizing them as complementary is an ongoing process. And I talk to a lot of other Buddhists in this space, and for them too, I think this is not an uncommon thing. It's always you want to sort of put your whole heart and effort into something and not be attached to the results. And so this is actually I think it's just a part of traditional Buddhist practice too, although the scope is envisioned as a little broader or more inclusive. Recently, I've been teaching a course on that just wrapped up on Buddhist perspectives on nature. And so we're kind of looking across Buddhist traditions as to what counts, what is capable of awakening, what is sentient, what is insentient. And you find that kind of varies across what merits our compassion. And that varies a bit across Buddhist culture. So that's something too that I think those of us involved in this work are, inquiring into. What is because our culture, those of us who grew up in kind of modern industrial cultures are so removed from the more than human world that we don't even know how to relate to it, much less what does it mean to have that, relationship be flavored by loving kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy, and equanimity. So this is going beyond the question you asked me, but I think really investigating relationality and our responsibility in our relations with the more than human world, as well as to human beings and future human beings, is all part of the inquiry for ecosattvas. Mm-hmm. And I like the term ecosattva because it doesn't have a previous use, so you don't associate it with one particular tradition. It doesn't even have to be Buddhist necessarily.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what I hear you, pointing towards is just this expansion in our moral circles, right? So on a Buddhist account, we sort of naturally care about ourselves primarily, but then maybe our families as well, and our close friends, we care about them. And, maybe we find ourselves feeling less caring towards people outside those circles. And part of what Buddhism, particularly, I was going to say particularly Mahayana, but I'm sure Theravāda folks would dispute that. So Buddhists generally want you to expand this sphere of concern to include certainly all beings, but as you're saying, that the more than human sort of entities or beings or features of the world around us, and also future beings, right? Because in some sense, in the climate crisis, the folks who will have to deal with it the most are perhaps not even born yet. And so what does it mean to have compassion for the earth, but also for, future beings, for all sorts of things? And so, one question that this makes me think of is that, and this is an old Buddhist problem, but in some sense, expanding this sphere of compassion can be a little bit painful, right? Because all of a sudden you care about beings that before, when they were suffering, you were like, sucks for you, but, not my problem. And now when you expand this sphere of concern, it is your problem because you recognize their suffering as not fundamentally different from your own suffering. But from the perspective of someone who's trying to do this, is this inviting more suffering into your life? I'm anticipating that the answer is no, and I just want to hear you give your account of why it is worth it to do this or why it is not adding to suffering to do this.
Yeah, so this goes back to that question of, I see this as complementary to reducing suffering for myself as well as others, and also an ongoing inquiry and practice and challenge. And with regard to compassion, so we call them in Buddhism from Theravāda. So we find this, as you said, in Theravāda Buddhism as well, the concept of the brahmaviharas, right? So we have this, sometimes I think of it as loving kindness as the basic orientation we have towards all beings. And I might include plant beings and rock beings as well as animal beings in that. But in any case, we have animal, and of course, Buddhists have beings in the different realms as well, the gods and so on. In any case, however you define it, right? This is towards all beings. This loving kindness is the basic orientation of a free heart, a liberated heart, right? To liberate ourselves from afflictive emotions, we cultivate this loving kindness. And so it's freedom for ourselves and it's goodness for others. And then that's the basic lens. And then when we encounter suffering, the response based on that love is compassion. And when we encounter beauty or success, that response is that sympathetic joy, that third brahmavihara. And then to keep the whole thing in balance and really to make it liberating rather than suffering, there is that final piece, that final brahmavihara of equanimity. And so equanimity is accepting that you cannot control everything. You cannot control other beings' actions or their results. So it's a kind of letting go. And so you care like crazy and then you let go might be a way to put it. And I think that is kind of the crux for many of us of the ecosattva path, and actually probably also the path more traditionally conceived.
I think you should copyright the book title, "You Care Like Crazy and Then You Let Go." That is a great phrase. I love it. I'm going to be using it, and I'll try to credit you for it. Because it sounded like part of your sort of journey of being activated was at first this kind of falsely blissful state of not thinking about it, which, probably many of us find ourselves in, just because, we think, well, I don't have the capacity to worry or to think about that. And that yields some sort of temporary peace of mind. But what I hear you saying is that that's not a state of freedom for yourself and goodness for others, right? That is in some sense a failure to recognize that the connection, the interdependence that exists among all beings, that is just a fact. And that our failure to recognize it, isn't living in accord with reality.
Yeah, how things are, as the Buddhists say.
Yeah, just recognize reality as it is and trying to remove those layers of delusion. And so then it sounds like the next step was becoming aware, but then feeling paralyzed because what could I do that could have any effect? And then it sounds like this next step is realizing you have to care like crazy and then let it go. That the reason to be an activist is certainly you hope that there's some positive effect, but like you said, you don't control the effect. All you can do is do the work and
and the caring through action itself, and sometimes it's just action in terms of talking with other people who are in creating community with other people who are trying to grapple with what's happening, recognizing in community how things are, but that work, that caring is in itself liberating. So I think it's quite related to that traditional, and this is a traditional idea, the liberation of the heart.
Mm-hmm. And what are some of the, maybe concrete or specific techniques that you engage in that help you do this practice? So you mentioned being in community. I know that you go on retreats. I must say I'm very jealous. Sometimes I've emailed you and I'll get the bounce back of like, I'm not answering email for 2 weeks because I'm on retreat. It's like, this is a good way to be. So what are some of the things that help keep you able to do this work?
Yeah, well, lately I've had to cancel a couple of retreats, so it feels, I would normally say that that's part of what helps. But I think for this crisis, I think many of us are discovering the value of that second refuge of Sangha, of community, that is absolutely fundamental to anything we're going to do to abate or ameliorate, where we're not going to stop this crisis, the ecological and climate crisis, but at least not in the near term. But so being in community, and part of that, it might be collective action. Again, part of that might just be creating a space to feel what many of us are feeling. I mentioned eco-grief as being a critical part of that before, some of what I'm doing. So creating and practicing in community and building that relationality with the more than human world, or including some of that more than human world in the community in whatever ways we can, which might be very elementary for some of us who are, again, did not grow up with that kind of orientation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, another sort of question that arises is, so from someone who sort of had their origins in Buddhist studies in this like highly philosophical, textually based world, and now is interested in, sort of being motivated by and using Buddhist resources to think about this, ecological crisis that wasn't on the Buddhist radar in the 5th century BCE. How do you think about the relationship between this, present and future-oriented activity and your sort of grounding in the historical study of Buddhist philosophy. How do you put those things together? How do you keep them separate? How do you think about that?
Yeah, so I've been teaching a couple courses lately, trying to work it out. So how does this relate to, what I spent so many years studying? And I find it enriches. Sometimes, students are like, why are we studying all this historical stuff? This is too academic. I want to know, what what do we do now today? How do we think about what's going on now? And I've always been a very kind of historical, even my dissertation was kind of little, historical, kind of about history of ideas. And I think that looking historically at how different people in different places have grappled with the fundamental questions of the human condition helps us imagine possible futures, and hopefully possible futures that are better than some of them that we seem like we're on track for right now. So I feel like, and it helps us get out of, we get so oriented towards, our immediate, we get this kind of presentism. We think this is the way it's always been, and we can get locked into this kind of, this system can never change. It can never be different. This is just how things are. And when we take a historical perspective, we say, no, actually, there's been many ways in which people have related to the human condition and the world. We can bring those resources to the present. Mm-hmm. And so that's, anyways, that's how I see it. That's how I relate my kind of philosophical and, especially history of ideas kind of focus intellectually to, that's how I related to this practical and very real, spiritual problem as well.
Yeah, that it has this function of kind of shaking up some of your assumptions, right? There's a classic example of the fish in the fish tank has never heard of water because water's all around. That's just assumed. The way that we sort of exist a lot of the time is just, certain things are taken for granted. And when you engage in this kind of philosophical, historical study, you're plopped into the middle of worlds that don't necessarily have your same assumptions. And
I would say cross-cultural too. I think that's the real value of, which is another huge interest of mine, is cross-cultural study of philosophy, religion. And there's the distinction between philosophy and religion will be the topic of my intro for this course, because it's a little bit historically specific how we draw that distinction.
Yeah, exactly. That one of the goals of all of this, right, is sort of becoming more self-aware of our cultural and modern historical assumptions and thinking ways out of them, because certainly part of the problem is with some of our modernist assumptions is that they lead inevitably to the kinds of results that we have seen with regard to the climate and other various topics. And so getting outside of that and in the sort of rigorous process of trying to follow arguments and take, sort of new points of view really seriously, to delve into them, to sort of sit with them in this serious way, it forces you to reconsider some of perhaps the things that you always assumed were obviously true.
And that you thought you couldn't change.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that it educates the imagination.
Mm-hmm. That's a good way to put it. I like that.
That's a phrase I stole from Charles Hallisey. But
good phrase. I will credit it too when I use it, which I will.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that just to, realizing that another future, another way of being is possible is sometimes the hardest part. Just perhaps some of our listeners have been watching the Olympics recently, and in many of the cases, these athletes talk about how the hardest part is just realizing that you can do something, and that the first person to do it has this high hurdle because they don't know if it can be done. But then once somebody does it, everyone else can say, oh, it is possible. And their path to doing it themselves is usually much shorter than the person who had to originally
Like the 4-minute mile, wasn't it? Like somebody broke it and then
Roger
like
Bannister. Yes. Yeah, that indeed this goes back to the issue of imagination, right? That imagining that something is possible, that a radically different mode of being is possible, seems like the easiest thing, but is often the hardest thing in terms of, transforming ourselves or reorienting practice or anything else. But so your mention of the course brings us to maybe I'd love to give listeners kind of a preview of what they could expect in Buddhist Studies Online 103, Indian Buddhist Philosophy, which will be taught by, of course, Karin Meyers right here. And so maybe we can go through module by module and have you give a sense of, what students can expect, what are the kind of questions that you're thinking about as driving it, and maybe what excites you about doing all of this. I find that when I'm teaching, it's always the best when I'm still working out these issues. They're not cut and dry. But so we start in Module 1 with mainstream Indian Buddhist philosophy. And if you'd like, you can also start with this question of the relationship between religion and philosophy, or you can dive right in.
Yeah, so I'm not sure whether I'll put it in a little intro video or in the module itself, because the module is quite full. But I think it's really important in terms of orientation to think about what is philosophy. And so I'm going to share in a little section, wherever it occurs in the intro or in the first module, a little bit about how Indian philosophy has been excluded and how this reveals various assumptions about the work of philosophy versus the work of religion. And I'll just summarize it here, is that distinction we don't find in Indian Buddhist philosophy, and we're going to miss a lot if we try to apply it to Indian Buddhist philosophy. That said, we normally think of philosophy as the use of reason and the application of it to various problems, various metaphysical problems, ethical problems, ontological problems. I will define those terms in the course. And so this first module is really just getting the basic orientation. And so these are things, topics which people have probably already had some exposure to. And so the doctrine of no self and dependent origination, and how that relates to the Buddhist path will be a key topic. And then kind of what happens as Buddhism develops systematically. And so this happens in this orientation to philosophy. It's also a section of the canon we call the Abhidharma. And so the Abhidharma, the higher Dharma, really starts to work out systematically all of the stuff, all the teachings that we find in early Buddhism, including especially the doctrine of not self and dependent origination, and also the philosophy of the path. Sometimes people tend to think of the Abhidharma as really focused on what exists, but it's actually interested, we touched on this before, in what exists, because it wants to answer this question of how we get free. And so a major focus of the Abhidharma is the categorization of different kinds of mental states as wholesome or skillful and unwholesome, unskillful, different kinds of minds as more or less liberated, as well as thinking about the relationship between these, which would be dependent origination. So really thinking about the processes of defilement and purification, and how we get free from suffering is a central orientation of the Abhidharma. So that's really the focus of the first unit, as well as a look at the Pudgalavada school or the personalist school, this early school of Buddhism that asserted the person is real. And some Buddhists thought this conflicted with the Buddha's teachings on not self. And so we'll get into that. It raises lots of interesting questions about how language works and how the basic logic of the path works if there is no self. So it'll give us a chance to explore that a little bit.
Mm-hmm. And I am so excited for this course just because, so I taught the BSO 101 course, and, you're trying to do justice to all of the aspects of Buddhism, including, art history and practice and a little bit of philosophy and history. And, we just got to barely scratch the surface of all of these issues. And it sounds like you're going to be able to dig right in.
Yeah. Although I'd have to say, I think of this course, and I read this in the scripture, it's a little bit more like a map. Like we're going to get in and see, okay, what are the basic, fundamental problems that are interesting to each of these phases of the development of Buddhist thought. And actually, I should say, Abhidharma continues to develop even when we get the Mahayana schools, which are the topic of the next module. And so, the details, we'll get to some of the details, but the main thing is to get a framework so that people, if they're interested, can go further and know what to look for, what are, have a basic orientation, because it's so, it's a lot of centuries that I'm covering and also really profound topics. So I'm excited. I get excited about maps. I find them very helpful. So I'm excited to help provide that for students.
Mm-hmm. And that metaphor is so useful of just, figuring out your bearings, right? What is the general landscape? And then you can kind of zoom in on the places where you feel, most interested or compelled or want to learn more. And so,
and sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no. I was going to talk about module 2, but if you had something more related to module 1. Okay. So you mentioned module 2 there, and that's called the Mahayana movement and 2 approaches to emptiness. So Madhyamaka and Yogacara. And so what will students look forward to in that module?
Yeah. So I really, I'm very interested, and this is what I was going to say before, is just in the development, again, in the history of ideas. So I want to look at how these schools, it's not a break, even though they've got these new sutras, and we'll talk about that when we talk about the origins of the Mahayana, even though they've got some teachings which don't appear to have been widely circulated anyway, previously, arising around the first century before the Common Era, first century of the Common Era, we get some what look like really new interpretations of Buddhist thought. But if we look at them closely, we'll see it's an extension of earlier problems. So in particular, in regard to Madhyamaka and Yogacara, sometimes they're looked at as really like, sometimes some schools, this happens a lot in Tibetan Buddhism, they'll want to hierarchically rank them, like Yogacara is better than early Buddhism, but somehow it's less good than Madhyamaka. I think that's a little bit of a mistake, because it leaves out what each of these schools is really contributing to the understanding of the basic problem of suffering. And so I plan in that unit to articulate, well, how are they both interpreting this fundamental doctrine of emptiness, which is really being articulated perhaps in a new way, even if not entirely new, in the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras. And so each has its own response to this doctrine of emptiness. And they really can be seen as complementary. Mm-hmm. So I want to look at that, as well as talk about why people have seen them as not complementary. There's a book, Yogacara and Madhyamaka, Allies or Rivals, Allies or Rivals, edited, I believe, by Jay Garfield.
And Jan Westerhoff, perhaps?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
This is an important question when we think about Madhyamaka and Yogacara, how they relate to each other. So that's that second module. And really like, okay, if everything is empty, what do we do with all the Buddhist teachings?
Yeah, what next? Yeah, and that, this is a sort of a classic when one sort of encounters Buddhism for the first time, it's overwhelming. There's so much, and you can understand the impulse to want to say, well, this is, earlier mainstream or represented in the modern period by Theravāda Buddhism, and this is Mahayana, and they're distinct, and put everything into its nice little box. But, as you're pointing us to, the reality is that these are sort of continual, they're responding to similar questions, and maybe they have slightly different answers, but they have a lot more in common than what we think. And this actually brings me to kind of a topic maybe outside the module structure, and we'll return to that. But in your sort of academic bio, you mentioned practicing in both Theravāda and Tibetan traditions. And so this goes to the same question, because I could imagine someone looking at that and saying, well, those things are totally different, right? Those things seem fundamentally incompatible. But perhaps, and I invite you to speak on this, perhaps they're not so incompatible as some people might think.
Yeah, I agree.
Yep.
And actually, it's pretty common, I think, amongst Western practitioners, because we haven't grown up oriented. There are generations now of Western convert Buddhists who are, second generation or whatever, but often we get exposed to multiple traditions, and we find something of value and complementary in these traditions. So I think it's actually a fairly common thing, and just intellectually, that kind of sense to look for how things are complementary. How can both be true, mm-hmm. or how can both be valuable?
Mm-hmm. And that in the dialogue between them, you can have something emerge that perhaps you wouldn't have noticed if you were sort of really kind of latched on to one thing exclusively, which isn't to say that isn't what works for some people.
Yeah, so in that unit and in the next unit, which is further developments in Madhyamaka and Yogacara, I really kind of want to explore that territory, how in India and then a little bit outside of India, how Buddhists have understood these as, up to different things. So one of the things I like to think about is that Yogacara Buddhism, I think, is very much really concerned with the processes of defilement and purification, whereas Madhyamakas, not that they aren't interested in that, but they might be more primarily interested in what is the basic nature of our delusion about how things exist. And so because they have those different orientations, they're gonna say things a bit differently. And then they can correct each other's excesses, is something I think that happens too in the development of Buddhist thought. And even in the arising of Mahayana, I think there's some, well, I don't think this is well established. There's consensus agreement on this among scholars, but there's a response to some of the developments that had happened in Abhidharma thought. It kind of generates this focus on emptiness, and same with developments in Madhyamaka and Yogacara, sometimes correcting each other's imbalances. Mm-hmm. So,
and that in that dialogue or dialectic, you see the emerging of these new schools, of these new approaches.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So then the last module, module 4, is Buddha nature, Tathagata, Pure Land, and then esoteric Buddhism.
Yeah.
So
I should mention just in module 3 too, there is this little section, we're not going to have time. I mean, it's a whole, and maybe you will on Buddhist Studies Online have a whole course on this at some point, but Buddhist epistemology, because part of what happens within the development of Indian Buddhism, how, especially when they're debating with non-Buddhist schools, how do we, what are reliable sources of knowledge? Is it just reason? Can we rely on our sense perception? Do we need to rely on the authority of tradition? And so we'll touch upon that too, although a vast topic in and of itself, which would make a great course for Buddhist Studies Online. And then the last module really picks up on some of these other threads that emerge with the Mahayana that aren't really full schools unto themselves. And so, as you said, Kate, it's Buddha nature, Pure Land, and esoteric Buddhism, or Vajrayana Buddhism, or Buddhist Tantra. And so these are important ideas. Well, actually, Vajrayana Buddhism, we could say, develops into a whole practice system in India. Buddha nature and Pure Land, they really get developed when Buddhism goes to East Asia, although also found in Tibet, incorporated into the Vajrayana Buddhism of Tibet. So this last module was really meant to provide a kind of map of, the foundations in Indian Buddhist thought, which are going to be really important and essential for understanding what happens as Buddhism moved beyond India. So that felt like sometimes these things aren't considered like as much philosophy, but in my view, again, not paying too much credence to this distinction between philosophy and religion. They are really important for Buddhist thought, and even become, the basis of important arguments and thinking about, again, the fundamental nature of human suffering, but also how things exist, how we get free. So I thought that would be important to include in a really, fairly short 4-week course on Indian Buddhist philosophy.
Mm-hmm. And surely one could spend, as much time as you have and more,
yeah, I'm sure you'll have
things
in the future a course on each of those topics. Mm-hmm. I was looking at the yoga studies online courses, and I got, there's so many great, I just love the model of really providing this, for people who are not necessarily in, maybe some people are, but in university programs in a really kind of digestible and convenient form is just, I think, a really good service.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, our goal is to be sort of accessible, affordable, and high quality, right? So sometimes, I'm sure lots of students are like, only 4 weeks, but it does sort of allow, these nice chunks that can fit into people's lives. And then in future courses, delve in even deeper. And so, yeah, our hope always is that this provides, an opportunity for folks who can't take, a couple years and go to Oxford or SOAS or any of those places to be able to get this map, get this exposure, as you're saying, and then have the resources. And then once you have a map, you can explore further. So,
and I'm sure other teachers like will point students towards, okay, if you're interested in this topic, here's, one of the things us academics like to do is, share our bibliography. I mean, that's like part of the fun of academia is collecting. So, I love this article on this topic and this. So it's a good excuse to be able to share some of those resources with people, on topics that they're interested in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I was tempted in teaching my course, for each slide to just like have a list of books.
Yeah, here's the 20 other things to read.
So in this 90-minute lecture, it's just going to be like, well, on this topic, read these things, and on this topic, read these things. So, obviously you don't go there. You try to provide, this comprehensive account. Yes. But also have those resources available for those who want them. And well, let's see. Thank you so much for, introducing yourself, giving sort of a sense of your research and your interests and your activities, as well as the course. Is there anything else that we missed that you'd like to let people know?
Oh, I think we covered quite a lot. So just that I'm looking forward to teaching this course and meeting all of the students. So that's it. And thank you. I really enjoyed, I was a little bit nervous about it, but I really enjoyed this, chance to talk about, my interest in Buddhism and also in this course.
Yes, it's quite an unnatural thing to say to an old friend, like, oh, let's have this conversation, but let's record it and then release it to the public.
Right.
All of a sudden, the standards of, coherence have been raised. But I think we put together a good conversation, and I hope people like it. But thank you so much for talking with us here. I'll give the sign off that, thank you so much to everyone in the audience for listening to the Buddhist Studies podcast. Stay tuned for more interviews with scholars and practitioners of Buddhism. So thanks again.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Bye.
Yang